The trauma surgeon had already placed the consent papers in front of me when my nephew suddenly sat halfway up in his hospital bed, pointed directly at me, and shouted, "Don't let him touch me!" He only raised me because he wanted my father's money. Every doctor, every nurse, every person in that trauma room turned and stared at me. Nobody said a word. I didn't defend myself. I didn't tell them he was wrong, because the most painful part wasn't hearing those words. It was knowing exactly who had spent 12 years teaching him to believe them. The surgeon quietly pulled the paperwork back toward herself. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully, "if the patient refuses your consent, there's very little we can legally allow you to decide." I simply nodded. If Lucas wanted me gone, I would leave. I had spent 12 years protecting him. I wasn't about to stop because he hated me. I reached for my jacket, ready to walk out of the room, when the emergency doors burst open behind me. An older woman with silver hair hurried inside, carrying a worn leather briefcase so tightly against her chest that her knuckles had turned white. She looked straight at me before raising her voice just enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Daniel, don't sign anything. Not until Lucas sees what's inside this box." Every conversation stopped. Even the monitors seemed louder in the silence that followed. The woman opened her briefcase and carefully removed a small cedar box sealed with dark blue wax. I hadn't seen that box in almost 20 years. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. Across the lid, written in my younger brother Michael's unmistakable handwriting, were words I never believed anyone else would read. For Lucas, but only after he truly believes Daniel never loved him. The surgeon lowered the clipboard. One of the nurses quietly whispered, "What is that?" I couldn't answer her, because at that moment I already knew my brother had seen this day coming long before any of us did. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. This isn't a story about inheritance. It isn't a story about revenge. It's the story of a promise between two brothers, a lie that stole 12 years from a father and his son, and one wooden box that carried the truth until the exact day it was needed most. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 53 years old, and before I retired, I spent 29 years as a fire captain. People used to think the bravest thing I ever did was run into burning buildings. They were wrong. The bravest thing I ever did happened after the fires were over. When my younger brother looked at me through smoke, blood, and broken concrete, realized he wasn't going to survive, placed his 8-year-old son in my arms, and asked me for one thing, I never had the strength to refuse. I kept that promise every single day for the next 12 years. I never missed a birthday. I never missed a school play. I never missed a parent-teacher conference, a baseball game, or a Christmas morning. I loved that boy as completely as any father could love a son. Then one lie destroyed everything we had built. Lucas stopped answering my calls. He stopped opening my letters. Eventually, he stopped believing I had ever loved him at all. For 12 long years, I let him hate me, because breaking a promise to my dying brother seemed even worse than breaking my own heart. Standing outside that trauma room, staring at the cedar box Michael had left behind, I realized something that terrified me more than every burning building I had ever entered. My brother hadn't asked Sarah Collins to protect that box until Lucas was ready. He had asked her to protect it until the day my silence became more dangerous than the truth itself. Looking back now, I sometimes think my life was divided into two different fires. The first was the one everyone saw on the evening news. The second burned quietly inside our family for the next 12 years. The first one started just after midnight, on a cold November evening. I was finishing paperwork at Station 7 when the dispatcher's voice came over the radio. Residential structure fire. Possible entrapment. Willow Creek Road. I remember grabbing my helmet without even looking at the address, because that's what 30 years in the fire service teaches you. You don't think, you move. Halfway to the engine, my captain caught my arm. His face had already turned pale. He didn't have to say anything. I saw the address on the dispatch screen before he spoke. It was my brother Michael's house. I drove faster than I should have, praying the dispatcher had made a mistake. Firefighters are trained to stay calm because panic gets people killed. That night, I wasn't a firefighter. I was an older brother trying to outrun the impossible. The house was already fully involved when we arrived. Flames were rolling through the roof, windows were exploding one after another, and neighbors stood helplessly across the street screaming that 2 adults were still inside. Someone grabbed my shoulder to stop me from going in. I shoved him away. Rules don't mean much when the people trapped behind the fire are your own family. I made it halfway down the hallway before part of the ceiling collapsed. Another firefighter dragged me back outside while I fought him every step of the way. I can still remember the smell of smoke on his jacket when he pinned me to the ground and kept saying the same words over and over. "You can't save them if you're dead too." He was right. I hated him for being right. 23 minutes later, they found Michael near the staircase. Emily was only a few feet away. Neither of them had survived long enough for us to reach them. The only reason 8-year-old Lucas was still alive was because Emily had pushed him through the bedroom window before the fire cut off the stairs. A neighbor caught him just before the flames swallowed the entire second floor. I found him sitting in the back of an ambulance wrapped in a gray blanket that looked far too large for his little body. He wasn't crying. He was staring at the burning house with empty eyes, still clutching the small wooden toy airplane Michael had carved for him the previous Christmas. When he saw me, he stood up and asked the question no child should ever have to ask. "Is my dad coming too?" I wish I could tell you I found the right words. I didn't. I knelt in front of him, wrapped my arms around his shaking shoulders, and cried with him because sometimes love doesn't sound like wisdom. Sometimes it sounds like silence shared between 2 people whose world has ended at the same moment. Just before dawn, one of the paramedics walked over carrying a fireproof evidence bag. Inside was Michael's wallet, his wedding ring, and a folded envelope with my name written across the front. The edges were burned black, but my name was still clear enough to read. I opened it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. There were only 3 short sentences inside. "Daniel, if you're reading this, then I wasn't able to keep my promise to Lucas. So now I'm asking you to keep yours. Raise him to become the kind of man who measures people by their character, never by what they can give him. And whatever happens, never let him spend his life believing he owes you for saving his." I folded the letter and placed it inside my jacket without letting anyone else read it. That promise became the center of my life before the sun even came up. I didn't know then that one day keeping those words would cost me the very boy they were meant to protect. People sometimes tell me I saved Lucas that night, but that's never been true. Pulling a child out of a tragedy isn't the same as raising him through the years that follow. The fire lasted less than an hour. Becoming his father lasted the rest of my life. 3 days after Michael and Emily were buried, the social worker sat across from me with a stack of adoption papers and spoke in the careful voice professionals use when they think they're asking too much of someone. She reminded me I was single, that my work schedule was unpredictable, that raising an 8-year-old boy alone would change everything. I listened politely until she finished. Then I signed every page without reading a single line. There wasn't a decision to make. I'd already made it the moment I folded Michael's letter into my jacket beside the burning ruins of his home. Lucas came to live with me the following weekend, carrying 1 small duffel bag, a cardboard box of photographs, and the wooden airplane he'd refused to let anyone throw away. He walked into my little house as quietly as someone entering a stranger's life instead of a new home. That first night, I heard him crying through the bedroom wall long after midnight. I stood outside his door with my hand on the doorknob for nearly 5 minutes before finally going in. He was sitting on the floor, holding his mother's sweater against his face. He looked embarrassed when he saw me, as though grief were something children were supposed to hide. I sat down beside him without saying anything. After a while, he leaned against my shoulder, and we stayed there until both of us fell asleep, sitting on the carpet. That became the first lesson he unknowingly taught me about fatherhood. Children rarely remember the speeches adults make. They remember who stayed in the room when everything hurt. Life slowly found a rhythm after that. I learned to braid shoelaces before school, pack lunches that came back half-eaten, and cook dinners that didn't come out of a fire station kitchen. Every morning I woke an hour earlier so I could make him pancakes, because Michael used to do that every Saturday, and I wanted him to feel at least one piece of his old life hadn't disappeared. They weren't very good at first. Lucas politely covered them in enough syrup to hide every mistake. A few months later, he looked at me across the breakfast table and said, "They're getting better." I don't think he was talking about the pancakes. I kept working at the station, but I traded promotions twice because higher rank would have meant longer shifts and more nights away from home. Some of the younger firefighters thought I was crazy for turning down opportunities I'd worked years to earn. I never explained myself. Careers can wait. Childhood can't. I coached his little league team even though I knew almost nothing about baseball. The first season we lost nearly every game, but every Friday afternoon Lucas still asked if practice was on because he liked the ride home afterward more than the score. We'd stop for burgers at the same little diner on Oak Street, and he'd tell me about school while pretending not to notice I always gave him the larger milkshake. When he was 10, he broke his wrist trying to jump his bicycle over a homemade ramp behind the garage. As the doctor wrapped the cast, Lucas looked terrified that I might be angry. I laughed so hard the nurse started laughing too. "Your dad did the same thing when he was 11, I told him. "The only difference is your father missed the ramp completely." That was the first time I accidentally called Michael your dad instead of using his name. Lucas smiled and quietly answered, "I know." Then, after a long pause, he added 3 words that I carried with me for years. "You're my dad too." I turned toward the window because I didn't trust my voice enough to answer. Nobody had coached him to say it. Nobody had corrected him afterward. It simply became our life. Parent-teacher conferences, science fairs, camping trips where neither of us caught a single fish. Late-night homework at the kitchen table while I struggled through algebra I'd forgotten 20 years earlier. Every ordinary moment stitched another piece of our family together. On the anniversary of the fire each year, we drove to the cemetery with fresh flowers. We never stayed long because Michael had once told me cemeteries were for remembering people, not living with them. Lucas usually talked to his parents for a minute or two before we headed home. One autumn afternoon, when he was nearly 15, he stood beside his father's grave much longer than usual. On the drive back, he stared quietly out the passenger window until he finally asked a question I had always known would come someday. "Uncle Daniel." He hadn't called me that in years. "If Mom and Dad were still alive, would you still have wanted me?" My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I answered without looking away from the road because some truths are easier to speak when you're watching the miles ahead instead of the tears beside you. "Lucas, I never wanted you because your parents died." I smiled through the ache building in my chest. "I wanted you because somewhere along the way you became my son." He didn't answer. He simply looked back out the window, and for the rest of the drive neither of us spoke another word. I thought that conversation had settled every doubt still living inside his heart. I had no idea someone else had already begun planting entirely different answers. Answers carefully designed to make him question every memory we had built together. Looking back now, I don't believe families usually fall apart because of one enormous lie. They fall apart because of hundreds of small lies that sound reasonable until they become impossible to separate from the truth. Rebecca Carter understood that better than anyone I have ever met. She never walked into my house accusing me of stealing my brother's son. She never stood in front of Lucas and told him I was a fraud. She was much smarter than that. She planted questions instead of answers, knowing that questions grow on their own if you leave them alone long enough. Rebecca was Emily's older cousin, a successful real estate agent who always dressed perfectly and somehow managed to sound kind, even when she was poisoning someone's mind. During the first few years after the fire, she visited often enough that Lucas looked forward to seeing her. She brought birthday gifts, remembered school events, and never missed a holiday dinner. I was grateful because I believed every child deserved as many people loving them as possible. I never imagined she was quietly becoming the one person who would eventually convince him to doubt the only home he had left. It began so gently that I barely noticed. One afternoon, after Lucas turned 16, he asked me a question that seemed harmless. "Uncle Rebecca says Mom and Dad left a pretty big insurance payment after the fire. Is that true?" I answered honestly. "Yes, they did." He nodded and didn't ask anything else. A week later, another question came while we were fixing the old fence behind the house. "Who decided where all that money went?" Again, I answered truthfully. "The probate court. Most of it was placed into a protected trust under your name until you became an adult. The rest covered debts, legal costs, and keeping your parents' house from being sold immediately after the fire." He accepted the explanation, but something in his eyes told me he wasn't asking because he wanted information anymore. He was asking because someone had already suggested my answers might not be the whole story. I should have asked where those questions were coming from. I didn't. That's a mistake I'll regret for the rest of my life. I believed trust built over years was stronger than suspicion whispered over a few conversations. I underestimated what repeated lies can do to a young heart searching for certainty. Over the next several months, Lucas changed in ways that were almost too small to notice until they weren't. He stopped telling me about school. He spent more weekends away from home. When I asked where he had been, he answered politely, but briefly, as though every conversation had become an obligation instead of something he enjoyed. One evening I found him sitting alone on the back porch, staring at the stars. I sat beside him with 2 cups of hot chocolate, just as I had done dozens of times before. Usually we talked for an hour. That night he barely touched his cup. Finally he looked at me and quietly asked, "Have you ever hidden anything from me?" The question hit harder than he could possibly have known, because Michael's letter immediately came back into my mind. I had hidden one thing from him, not because I wanted to deceive him, but because I had promised my dying brother that Lucas would never grow up feeling like he owed me his future. I chose my words carefully. Everyone keeps some promises that are difficult to explain. He looked disappointed by the answer. That's not what I asked. I wanted so badly to tell him everything. I wanted to pull Michael's letter out of the locked drawer where I'd kept it for years and place it in his hands. But promises lose their meaning the moment we only keep them when they're convenient. I smiled sadly and said, "One day you'll understand why." He stood without another word and went inside. That was the first evening he didn't tell me goodnight. Looking back, I think that was the moment Rebecca realized she was winning. A month later, I came home from the fire station and found an expensive pickup truck parked outside my house. Rebecca was sitting in the kitchen with Lucas when I walked in. They stopped talking the instant they heard the door open. She smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. "Daniel," she said warmly, "we were just looking through some old family photographs." I nodded and greeted them both, but something felt wrong. The photographs spread across the table weren't family albums. They were copies of probate documents, insurance summaries, and property records. Rebecca casually gathered them into a neat pile before I could read the pages. "Lucas is old enough to start understanding his parents' finances," she said. "Don't you think he deserves to know everything?" Before I could answer, Lucas looked directly at me and asked the one question I had never prepared myself to hear. "Did you ever use any of my parents' money to pay for this house?" I answered immediately. "No." That part was true. I had bought the house years before Michael died. Rebecca smiled again, but this time there wasn't an ounce of kindness behind it. "Maybe not the house," she said softly, "but money has a funny way of disappearing over the years, doesn't it?" I looked at Lucas, hoping he would see through what she was doing. Instead, for the very first time since I had raised him, he looked back at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Not anger, not disappointment, suspicion. And in that single moment, I realized I was no longer fighting against grief. I was fighting against a story someone else had already convinced my son to believe. I used to believe that if you loved someone long enough, they would eventually recognize that love for what it was. Age has a way of teaching you that love and truth are not always the same thing. Love can stay exactly where it has always been, while the truth is quietly replaced by someone else's version of events. That's what happened to Lucas and me. It didn't happen overnight. It happened one conversation at a time until one afternoon he walked into my living room carrying a backpack instead of his baseball glove. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw it. Teenagers don't pack their lives into a backpack unless they've already decided where they're going. He stood in front of me for several seconds before speaking, almost as though he hoped I would somehow make the conversation unnecessary. Finally, he looked down at the floor and said, "I'm moving out." I remember smiling because I honestly thought he meant college. "Already planning ahead?" I asked. "You've still got another year before graduation." He slowly shook his head. "Not next year. Today." My smile disappeared. "Where are you going?" Rebecca said I can stay with her until I figure things out. For a long moment I couldn't find the words. I had carried that boy through nightmares, fevers, broken bones, and every fear childhood could invent. Yet somehow I had never imagined the day he would tell me he no longer wanted to come home. I asked the only question that mattered. Did I do something? He looked away before answering. I don't know anymore. Those 5 words hurt more than if he had screamed at me, because confusion lasts longer than anger. Anger burns hot and eventually dies. Doubt settles into the heart and quietly changes the way every memory is remembered. I took one slow breath and said, "Then ask me anything. Whatever you've been told, ask me yourself." He hesitated. For one brief second, I thought he might. Instead, he reached into his backpack, removed a folder filled with copied financial documents, and placed it on the kitchen table. Rebecca says Mom and Dad left enough money that I should never have struggled growing up. I stared at the papers without touching them. She says you controlled everything. I stayed silent. She says you kept me close because if I ever asked too many questions, you'd lose access to what belonged to my family. I looked into the eyes of the boy I had raised, and for the first time since that night outside the burning house, I saw someone who wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for evidence against me. I could have opened the locked drawer in my study. Michael's letter was inside. The trust records were inside. Every receipt showing exactly where every dollar had gone was inside. I could have ended the entire argument in less than 10 minutes. My hand actually started moving toward the hallway before I stopped myself. The promise. Michael hadn't asked me to protect his money. He had asked me to protect his son from growing up believing he owed me his life. If I dumped every sacrifice I had ever made onto that kitchen table, Lucas wouldn't see love. He would see debt. And my brother had begged me never to let that happen. I slowly lowered my hand and quietly said, "If one day you decide you want the truth, I'll still be here." He looked almost disappointed that I wasn't defending myself harder. "That's it?" he asked. "You're not even going to deny any of it?" I smiled sadly. Some arguments can't be won the moment they're happening. He picked up his backpack and walked toward the front door. Halfway there, he stopped without turning around. "I used to think Dad would have wanted me to stay with you." My heart nearly stopped. Then he added the words that echoed inside my head for the next 12 years. "Now, I'm not so sure he ever trusted you at all." The front door closed before I could answer. I stood there listening to the silence until I realized I was still holding the coffee mug I'd made for him that morning. It had already gone cold. That evening, I walked into his bedroom and sat on the edge of the neatly made bed. His favorite baseball cap was still hanging on the wall. The old wooden airplane Michael had carved all those years ago was sitting on the bookshelf, exactly where Lucas always kept it. He had taken his clothes, his laptop, and his backpack. He had left behind every memory that reminded him of us. I reached for the airplane, turned it over in my hands, and noticed something carved into the bottom that I had somehow never seen before. Michael had engraved 2 simple words beneath one wing, "For always." I held that little airplane against my chest longer than I care to admit. The next morning I wrapped Lucas's birthday present, even though his birthday was still 3 months away. When the day finally came, I drove to Rebecca's house, left the gift on the front porch, rang the bell, and walked back to my truck before anyone answered. An hour later, I drove past again. The box was still sitting exactly where I had left it. 2 days later, it disappeared. I never learned whether Lucas opened it or Rebecca threw it away. I repeated that same routine every birthday, every Christmas, every graduation. Every milestone I could only imagine from a distance. 12 years of gifts. 12 years of letters I never mailed because I no longer knew whether they would reach my son or the woman determined to erase me from his life. People often ask how I survived those years. The truth is, I didn't. I simply learned how to keep breathing while carrying a grief that never buried the dead, only the living. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, my phone rang with a number I had never seen before, and before I answered it, I had no idea my entire life was about to begin again. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday, just after 9 in the morning, while I was replacing brake pads on an old pickup that belonged to one of my regular customers. I almost ignored it because I didn't recognize the number, and after 12 years of silence, I had stopped expecting unexpected calls to bring anything good. Something made me answer anyway. A woman's voice came through the phone, calm at first, then breaking apart before she could finish her second sentence. "Mr. Brooks, my name is Dr. Olivia Bennett. I'm the trauma surgeon at St. Matthew's Medical Center. Your nephew, Lucas Brooks, was involved in a serious highway accident about an hour ago. Everything around me disappeared. The shop, the tools, the customer waiting outside. None of it existed anymore. There was only one sentence repeating in my head. Lucas is alive. Lucas needs help. I didn't ask who was at fault. I didn't ask how badly he was hurt. I grabbed my keys before she finished explaining the injuries and drove to the hospital faster than I had driven anywhere since the night my brother died. During the entire drive, I kept remembering the last words Lucas ever spoke to me, wondering if those would also become the last words I would ever hear from him. By the time I reached the emergency department, the waiting room was already crowded with police officers, nurses, and members of the trauma team moving with the quiet urgency that only hospitals understand. Dr. Bennett met me outside the operating suite. She was direct without being cold. Exactly the kind of doctor you pray for when someone you love is lying behind those doors. Lucas has multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and a ruptured spleen, she explained. We're stabilizing him now, but there's another problem. She paused before continuing. He's awake. I almost smiled. Thank God. She looked at me with genuine sympathy. He knows you're here. The smile disappeared before it had fully formed. He doesn't want to see me, does he? She lowered her eyes. No. Somehow that hurt more than every injury she had just described. I had prepared myself for the possibility of losing him. I wasn't prepared to discover that even while facing death, he still believed I was someone to keep outside the room. Doctor. Bennett led me into a small consultation office, where a stack of legal forms already waited on the table. Normally, she said carefully, the closest available family member would help make emergency decisions if the patient becomes unable to do so. But Lucas has made it very clear that he does not want you acting on his behalf. She pushed the paperwork gently toward me. If you sign these forms, you'll voluntarily surrender temporary decision-making authority, allowing the hospital to follow the instructions already provided by the patient. I looked down at the pen resting beside the papers. 12 years earlier, I had chosen to lose my son rather than break a promise to my brother. Now, I was being asked to lose him again, this time while he fought for his life only a few doors away. My hand moved toward the pen. Loving someone sometimes means accepting the role they've chosen for you, even when it breaks your heart. If stepping aside gave Lucas even a little peace before surgery, I would do it. Just as the tip of the pen touched the first page, the conference room door swung open so hard it struck the wall behind it. Sarah Collins hurried inside, breathing heavily, clutching the same weathered leather briefcase I remembered from my brother's funeral. She looked older, her hair almost completely silver now, but her eyes hadn't changed. They still carried the quiet determination of someone who never spoke unless the truth mattered. "Daniel," she said firmly, "don't sign those papers. Doctor." Bennett turned toward her in surprise. "Ma'am, this is a private consultation." Sarah nodded politely, but never took her eyes off me. "I know exactly where I am, doctor. And I also know that if Daniel signs those forms before Lucas sees what Michael left behind, an innocent man will lose his son for the second time." The room became perfectly still. Sarah slowly placed the old leather briefcase on the table and opened the brass clasps with trembling fingers. Inside rested a cedar box, no larger than a family Bible, sealed exactly as Michael had left it 20 years earlier, with dark blue wax still unbroken across the lid. "Doctor," Bennett looked from the box to me, confused by the emotion she saw on my face. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move, because I recognized not only the box, but the tiny burn mark along one corner, where Michael had accidentally dropped it beside a campfire the summer before he died. Sarah gently lifted it from the briefcase and whispered the words I had waited 2 decades to hear. "Your brother told me this box was never meant to save Lucas's future." She placed it carefully into my shaking hands. "He said it was meant to save the day Lucas stopped believing you were his father." I held the cedar box in both hands for several seconds without opening it. It wasn't because I was afraid of what was inside. It was because I knew my brother well enough to understand that Michael never did anything without a reason. If he had asked Sarah to keep this hidden for nearly 20 years, then whatever rested beneath that lid wasn't meant to answer one question. It was meant to answer every question Lucas would one day ask about me. Sarah quietly slid the sealed box across the table and looked at Dr. Bennett. Would it be possible for Lucas to see this before surgery? The doctor hesitated only briefly before nodding. He has a few minutes before anesthesia. If this affects his wishes, we need to know now. A nurse led us down a narrow hallway toward the trauma unit. Every step felt heavier than the last. I wasn't walking toward a hospital room anymore. I was walking toward the moment that would either give me my son back or take him away forever. When we reached the doorway, Lucas turned his face toward the opposite wall the instant he saw me. His voice was weak, but there was still enough anger left to keep me at a distance. I told them I don't want him here. Sarah stepped forward before I could speak. Lucas, your father left something for you. He frowned. My father died 20 years ago. Sarah nodded gently. Yes, and before he died, he trusted me with this. She placed the cedar box on the blanket beside him. The moment Lucas saw the dark blue wax seal, confusion replaced the anger in his eyes. What is this? Sarah smiled sadly. Something your father ordered me never to open. He said it belonged to you, but only after the day you truly believed Daniel never loved you. The room became completely silent. Even the steady rhythm of the heart monitor seemed louder than before. Lucas looked from the box to me and back again. Why would Dad write something like that? I didn't answer. I honestly didn't know. Sarah carefully broke the old wax seal and lifted the lid. Inside lay a neatly folded letter, a faded photograph, a small leather notebook, and a thick envelope held together by a worn rubber band. Resting on top of everything else was the old silver wristwatch Michael had worn every day since college. Lucas picked it up first. I remember this, he whispered. Dad never took it off. Sarah nodded. He didn't. The paramedics removed it after the fire. He asked me to keep it with the box. Lucas slowly unfolded the letter. I recognized Michael's handwriting immediately. He began reading aloud, though his voice grew quieter with every line. Son, if you're reading this, then something has happened that I prayed never would. If you've reached the point where you believe Daniel stopped loving you, then I need you to trust me one last time. Everything you are about to hear from other people, measure it against one simple truth. I trusted my brother with the only thing in this world that mattered more to me than my own life. I trusted him with you. Lucas stopped reading. His hands were trembling. Sarah gently encouraged him to continue. Daniel never asked me for money. He never asked me for my house. He never asked me for a single dollar of my insurance. The only thing he argued with me about was whether I should leave him this responsibility because he believed you deserved a better father than he could ever be. I laughed at him because I knew something he didn't. I knew no man would ever love you more fiercely than the one convinced he wasn't good enough. Lucas swallowed hard before reading the next paragraph. If anyone ever tells you Daniel kept you because of money, they are lying. Before this letter reaches your hands, open the large envelope beneath it. Those papers will show you something Daniel never wanted you to know. Lucas slowly reached for the thick envelope. Inside were copies of bank statements, mortgage records, tax returns, and dozens of receipts stretching across 12 years. Sarah quietly explained them one by one. Your college fund was never touched. Your father's life insurance remained protected, exactly as the court ordered. Daniel never spent a single dollar from it. Lucas frowned as he continued looking through the documents. Then he stopped on one receipt and stared at it for several seconds. This can't be right. Sarah looked down. What did you find? Lucas held up a property sale agreement dated 11 years earlier. The seller's name was Daniel Brooks. Purchase price far below market value, paid in full. He looked at me with genuine confusion for the first time in 12 years. You sold your house? I nodded quietly. The old one. Why? I remained silent. Sarah answered instead. Because the station where Daniel worked closed, and moving closer to your school cut nearly 3 hours of driving every day. Lucas shook his head. You could have told me that. Sarah slowly pulled another receipt from the envelope. No, he couldn't. Lucas looked down again. Hospital bills, school tuition, summer science camp, baseball equipment, dental surgery after he broke his front teeth at 13. Every expense had one thing in common: paid entirely from Daniel Brooks's personal account. Not 1 cent had come from Michael's trust. Lucas kept turning pages faster and faster as though he expected to find something proving all of it was false. Instead, every new document destroyed another lie Rebecca had planted. Finally, he reached the last sheet in the envelope. It wasn't a financial record. It was a handwritten note from Michael, addressed only to Sarah. If Daniel ever tries to show Lucas what he sacrificed, stop him. He'll think love needs to be repaid. Make sure my son understands the truth. Daniel didn't raise him because he owed me. He raised him because that's who he is. Lucas lowered every paper into his lap. Tears began falling silently onto the old documents. Then, for the first time since I walked into the hospital, he slowly turned his head toward me. His lips trembled as though he wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but could only find one. If none of this money was ever yours. He struggled to finish the sentence. Then why did you let me believe it was? Before I could answer, the anesthesiologist stepped quietly into the room, looked at the clock, and said the words neither of us was ready to hear. I'm sorry. We have to take him to surgery now. They wheeled Lucas toward the operating room before either of us could say another word. As his bed disappeared around the corner, he never took his eyes off me. For 12 years, he'd looked at me with suspicion, disappointment, and anger. This time, what I saw was something far more painful. Regret. The doors closed, and the red surgical light above them switched on. Just like that, I was left standing in the hallway holding Michael's cedar box while my son was fighting for his life, with questions neither of us had been given the chance to answer. Sarah gently touched my shoulder. He's starting to understand. I stared at the closed operating room doors and quietly answered, understanding doesn't help him if he doesn't survive long enough for us to talk. We sat together in the waiting room for what felt like hours. Hospitals have a strange relationship with time. 5 minutes can feel like a lifetime when someone you love is lying on the other side of a pair of steel doors. To keep my mind from imagining the worst, I began looking through the leather notebook Michael had left inside the cedar box. I had assumed it belonged to him. I was wrong. The first page was written in Sarah's handwriting. Daniel refused to keep any record of what he sacrificed for Lucas. He said, "Love that keeps score isn't really love." I started writing these notes because one day Lucas might need the truth from someone other than Daniel. I slowly turned the page. Every entry carried a date, a place, and a memory I had completely forgotten. May 14th. Daniel declined promotion to battalion chief because it would require overnight shifts away from Lucas. I smiled faintly. I remembered that conversation. Everyone at the station thought I had lost my mind. The next page. August 2nd. Daniel sold his fishing boat to pay for Lucas's science camp after learning the scholarship application had been denied. I had forgotten the boat entirely. Lucas hadn't. He cried for 2 weeks because he thought someone had stolen it. I told him I simply didn't have time to fish anymore. Another page. December 18th. Daniel canceled his own knee surgery after learning Lucas needed braces sooner than expected. He lived with the pain for almost 3 years before finally having the operation. I closed my eyes. I hadn't hidden those things because I wanted anyone to admire me. I hid them because children should never grow up believing every act of kindness creates a debt they must spend the rest of their lives repaying. Michael understood that. Sarah understood it. Rebecca never did. About an hour later, Dr. Bennett entered the waiting room, still wearing surgical scrubs. My heart stopped the moment I saw her expression. She walked directly toward me before speaking. The surgery went well. We controlled the bleeding, and Lucas is going to recover. I don't remember sitting down, but somehow I found myself in the nearest chair with both hands covering my face. I had walked into that hospital prepared to lose him a second time. Instead, for the first time in 12 years, I had been given hope. Doctor Bennett waited until I collected myself before continuing. He's awake. I stood immediately. Can I see him? She hesitated. There's something you should know first. My stomach tightened again. What is it? As soon as he regained consciousness, he asked for you. I couldn't speak. Those 4 words were everything I had dreamed about, and everything I had stopped believing would ever happen. Doctor. Bennett smiled softly. I think you should hear the rest from him. I walked into Lucas's room more nervous than I had been entering any burning building in my career. He looked pale, exhausted, and connected to more machines than any young man should ever have to see. But his eyes were open. The moment he saw me, tears immediately filled them. For a long time, neither of us spoke. 12 years of silence had left us both unsure where to begin. Finally, Lucas looked toward the chair beside his bed and quietly said, "Will you sit down?" I pulled the chair closer. He reached slowly beneath his blanket and held out Michael's old silver watch. Sarah said Dad wanted you to have this. I gently pushed his hand back. No. He frowned. But it belonged to him, I nodded. And now it belongs to you. He looked at the watch for several seconds before whispering, I don't deserve it. I leaned forward until we were looking directly at each other. Neither did I. He stared at me confused. I smiled sadly. Love isn't something we deserve, Lucas. It's something we're given. His shoulders began shaking. I believed her. I know. I thought you stayed because of the money. I know. I thought. His voice broke completely. I thought Dad would have been disappointed in you. I reached across the bed and gently squeezed his hand, for the first time in 12 years. Your father knew me better than anyone ever will. Lucas closed his eyes as tears rolled down both cheeks. There's one more thing Sarah didn't tell me. I waited. He opened his eyes again and looked directly into mine. If you never touched my trust fund. He struggled to breathe through the emotion. How did you pay for everything? Before I could answer, Sarah quietly stepped into the room carrying one final envelope that had been hidden beneath every other document inside the cedar box. She looked at both of us before placing it carefully on the bedside table. Because, she said softly, Michael knew that would be the last question Lucas would ask, and he wanted to answer it himself. Sarah waited until the room became quiet before opening the final envelope. Unlike everything else inside the cedar box, this one had never been sealed. Michael had written only one sentence across the front, in thick black ink. Daniel will never tell you this himself. Sarah carefully unfolded the pages and handed the first one to Lucas. It wasn't a letter, it was a list. At first glance it looked ordinary, but every line carried a date beside it. The first entry read, Promotion to Battalion Chief, declined. The second, Cabin on Lake Mercer, sold. The third, Retirement Fund, withdrawal. Lucas frowned as he turned another page. The list continued for years. Second mortgage, truck sold, vacation canceled, knee surgery postponed, house sold, night classes canceled. None of the pages contained dramatic speeches or emotional explanations. Just decisions. Quiet sacrifices recorded one after another until they filled nearly 20 pages. Sarah finally spoke. Michael asked me to document every major sacrifice Daniel made after the fire because he knew his brother would spend the rest of his life pretending none of them mattered. Lucas slowly looked toward me. Is this true? I smiled faintly. Most of it. Sarah exaggerated a little. She laughed through her tears. No, Daniel. If anything, I left half of it out. She reached into the envelope once more and removed a folded receipt. Tell him about this one. I recognized it immediately. You don't have to. Sarah ignored me and handed it to Lucas. It was an invoice from a specialist cancer clinic, dated almost 9 years earlier. Lucas read it twice before looking back at me. This is your name. I nodded. It was nothing serious. Sarah gently shook her head. That's another lie. I closed my eyes. I should have known she wouldn't let me hide anymore. Daniel was diagnosed with an early-stage lung condition caused by decades of smoke exposure. The doctors recommended immediate treatment and several months away from work. Lucas looked stunned. You never told me, I quietly answered. Because you had just been accepted into the engineering academy you dreamed about. Tuition wasn't fully covered, and taking medical leave would have meant losing the overtime that paid the difference. Lucas lowered the papers into his lap. So, you postponed your treatment? I nodded once. For a while. How long is a while? I smiled awkwardly. About 18 months. The room fell silent again. Lucas buried his face in his hands before whispering, I spent those 18 months believing you didn't even care enough to attend my robotics competitions. I looked toward the window. You never looked for me in the audience. He frowned. What? Sarah quietly opened her phone and handed it to him. Hundreds of photographs filled the screen. Lucas standing beside science fair projects. Lucas receiving academic awards. Lucas graduating high school. Every photograph had been taken from the back of an auditorium, outside a football field fence, or across a crowded parking lot. I had been there every single time, just never close enough to break the promise I made after he told me never to come looking for him again. Lucas stared at the pictures without speaking. Then he reached one taken on his 18th birthday. He was laughing with friends outside Rebecca's house. In the far background, almost hidden behind a parked truck, stood an older man wearing a baseball cap. Me. You came, he whispered. Every year, I answered softly. You told me to stay out of your life. You never told me I had to stop loving you. Lucas broke completely. He leaned forward despite the pain from surgery and wrapped both arms around me. For several seconds, neither of us could speak. I simply held him the way I had held him the night the fire took his parents, realizing that after 12 years of silence, my son had finally come home. When he pulled away, tears still running down his face, he looked directly into my eyes and asked the one question I had hoped he would never have to ask. Why didn't you fight harder to make me believe you? I took a slow breath before answering. Because your father asked me to raise a son who never felt indebted to me. And I was more afraid of breaking my promise to him than I was of breaking my own heart. Before Lucas could respond, there was a quiet knock at the hospital door. A uniformed sheriff stepped inside carrying a thin case file and looked directly at Sarah. Miss Collins, he said, we've located Rebecca Carter. He paused briefly before continuing. She admitted something none of us expected, and I think all of you deserve to hear it together. The sheriff waited until everyone in the room had settled before opening the thin case file. Rebecca Carter wasn't under arrest. She hadn't stolen money, forged documents, or committed fraud. What she had done was something far quieter, and in many ways, far more destructive. Over the previous 12 years, she had repeatedly told Lucas that Daniel had manipulated the probate process, lived off Michael's insurance money, and stayed in his life only because there was something to gain. When investigators questioned her, she admitted she had never seen a single document proving any of it. She had simply convinced herself it had to be true because, in her own words, nobody sacrifices that much without expecting something back. I remember hearing those words and realizing she had spent her entire life measuring love the way business people measure investments. She believed every kindness demanded a return. She couldn't imagine a man giving away his best years simply because he had made a promise to his dying brother. The sheriff closed the file and quietly said, Legally, there's very little we can charge her with. But everyone who heard her statement now knows exactly where those lies began. Rebecca sent me a letter several weeks later. It wasn't an apology in the way people usually imagine apologies. She didn't ask for forgiveness or excuse what she had done. She simply admitted that watching Michael trust me more than anyone else had filled her with resentment for years, and instead of dealing with that bitterness, she allowed it to poison an innocent boy. I never answered the letter. Not because I hated her, but because some conversations belong in the past once the truth has finally done its work. Lucas remained in the hospital for another 12 days before coming home. Home. It felt strange hearing that word again, after so many years. The first evening he walked through my front door, he stopped in the hallway exactly where he had stood as an 8-year-old boy carrying a single duffel bag after losing his parents. This time he was carrying Michael's cedar box under one arm and the old silver watch on his wrist. He looked around the house for several seconds before quietly smiling. Nothing changed. I laughed softly. One thing did. He looked at me. The pancakes got better. That was the first time we laughed together in over a decade, and somehow it sounded exactly the way I remembered. Recovery took months. Lucas came to every medical appointment I had postponed for years because of him. Doctor. Olivia Bennett wasn't happy when she discovered how long I had delayed treatment for my damaged lungs. But she also smiled the day she told me the condition was still manageable because we had finally started addressing it properly. "You've spent your whole life saving other people," she told me during one appointment. "It's about time someone helped save yours." Sarah Collins officially retired the following spring. Before leaving her law office for the last time, she handed Michael's original letter back to Lucas. "This belongs to the next generation now," she said. Lucas framed it instead of locking it away. He said promises should be seen, not hidden. A year after the accident, he graduated at the top of his engineering program. When his name was called, he didn't walk across the stage alone. Before accepting his diploma, he asked the dean for permission to invite one more person forward. I had no idea what he was doing until he reached the front row, held out his hand, and said loud enough for the entire auditorium to hear, "Dad, I can't accept this without the man who earned it long before I did." I don't remember crossing the stage. I only remember the sound of hundreds of people standing to applaud while my son wrapped his arms around me without a trace of shame or hesitation. There wasn't a dry eye in that auditorium, including mine. A few months later, Lucas accepted his first engineering position. But every Saturday morning, he still came to my house for breakfast. We sat on the back porch with 2 cups of coffee, watched the sunrise, and talked about ordinary things that had once seemed impossible to get back. Sometimes we spoke about Michael and Emily. Sometimes we didn't need to. Their presence was already there in every laugh we shared and every quiet moment we no longer took for granted. On the 20th anniversary of the fire, Lucas and I returned to the memorial where his parents' names were engraved. He placed Michael's old wooden airplane beneath the stone, looked at me, and smiled. "Dad," he said, "Grandpa once taught Uncle Michael that a real man keeps his promises. You kept yours for 20 years, even when it cost you almost everything." I looked toward my brother's name carved into the granite and finally felt a weight leave my heart that I had carried since the night of the fire. I had spent years believing the greatest promise I ever made was raising my brother's son. I know now that I was wrong. The greatest promise was never giving up on him, even after he gave up on me. Because blood may begin a family, but love is what carries it through every fire life places in its path. And if this old firefighter learned anything worth passing on, it's this: the people who truly love you rarely keep score. They simply keep showing up. Until one day, the truth finally finds its way home.